Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And we have two special shows today about people's experiences in the war. John Willis joins us to talk about his new book, The People's War. Links to purchasing the book are, as always, in the description below. This remarkable book draws heavily on the BBC's history project of the early 2000s. I'm delighted to have him with us. Good afternoon, John. How are you today?
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Paul. Thank you for inviting me.
So, memoirs, oral histories, recollection of people who participated things. We were just chatting before going live. It's always a complicated one because of the veracity, the storytelling. Tell us before we get into your book what the purpose and the history of the BBC archive was, because there are some people watching who probably weren't even alive when the archive was gathered in the early 2000s. So what was behind that project the BBC undertook?
Well, the BBC, wearing its very much its public service hat, decided it was the end of the memories of people who were involved in the Second World War starting to fade. It was the 60th anniversary, so 20 years ago, and they wanted to collect as many memories and testimonies before it was too late. There was also a secondary purpose, which was to teach the older generation how to use computers, to put their memories down on computers. So it had an educational focus. They galvanized local libraries, schools, charities, their own radio stations. They had a bus going around the country. So they collected an astonishing 47,000 different testimonies.
Wow. I mean, and that volume makes it an important resource, especially as we were just talking, as we're moving out of the era of participants in the war being with us to firmly in the past. There are a handful of people who survived or lived through the war with us, but a door is closing. And we had this discussion with Joseph Quinn last year about the People's Project he was involved in last year. Is that, do the people collating these interviews start any kind of editing process before putting them on websites, putting them or do you just put them up there and say, this is what the person said, it is what it is. It's then the reader, the viewer, the listener to then decide the process. And I think I guess it's like war diaries. You take them with what was written, and then you start dissecting them as to what was written accurately and what may have been mistakes may have been made. But that's the issue with oral histories and collated histories of events that even 20 years ago, it was still 60 years ago. So that's a bit about the BBC, bro. You had these 47,000 interviews and recollections to work with. You then want to make a book out of this. How on earth do you begin that process? You can't possibly have looked at every single one of the 47,000.
I couldn't, but what struck me immediately, because I'd used the archive a couple of times before, was a lot of it is beautifully written, so it's very atmospheric. And secondly, it's completely lacking in false heroics or glory. It's a very rooted, earthy, down-to-earth portrait by ordinary men and women. That really hits you as you start to plough through them. The BBC, helpfully up to a point, starred the testimonies they thought were particularly good.
Right.
The problem as an author, as I was trying to collate the stories and create a narrative and a book out of it, is that some of the very best stories were not starred by the BBC at all. So you couldn't rely on them selecting the stories. You had to go a long way down each particular category before you decided, well, I'm not going to get any further now.
I mean, one of the things that was obviously important to you is collating opinions and viewpoints from people outside of just Britain and across the world, because we should really remember that the BBC does reach the world, the World Service and what have you back in the day. Well, I suppose it still exists, doesn't it? People across the world. And I remember when I was living back in England, is that when an anniversary of something like VE Day would come around, they'd ask all the people in Colchester, which is where I was at the time, for their recollection, which is fantastic. But then you get a narrow view of the war. You got people who happen to be living in Colchester and what they remembered about VE Day, but that wouldn't necessarily represent the experiences of someone in, I don't know, Singapore or Sydney or West Africa. So were you surprised how diverse the accounts were on the BBC archive? They weren't just people from Manchester and London.
No. Given that this is a British archive collected by a British institution, the BBC, it's amazingly international. among the main characters in my books, I've got Canadians, I've got Americans. There's a woman who's in Hamburg when it's bombed. There's a strong Polish couple in it. So it's very mixed and very diverse. And I think those international perspectives add something to the voices from Colchester and elsewhere.
Yeah. And were you trying to, was there a particular message you wanted to get across in that, I don't know, something as simple as war is tragic or loss is profound, or were you really steered by what you found as to the direction of the project? In the one of the things I think, you wanted to reference is the common denominator of humor when people are in horrible situations, internment camps or POWs or flight crews, wherever it would be, is that, and maybe that's a particularly British thing, but I think it's actually international, is you find the humor in those situations. And I think particularly when you're then writing about it 60 years on, that humor would maybe be more vivid.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think humor is a survival tool. It's one of the ways that people got through, whether it's at home or in the mud of Monte Cassino or in a Japanese prison camp. Basically, humor was one way of surviving, as was comradeship, friendship, and sometimes just sheer luck. But there were lots of ways of trying to manage yourself on a day-to-day basis, and laughing at the absurd things that sometimes happen is one way of doing that.
And I think the other thing that about drawing on an archive that was created 6 decades after the war is that, in a sense, the tactical decisions have now been that it doesn't matter now. It doesn't matter whether the invasion should have happened a month earlier or a month later, or whether or not this particular general should or shouldn't have been in charge of an operation. That's all done and dusted now, except for military historians who dissect that stuff. But people who lived through things, what then becomes clear to them or important to them 6 decades on is how they got through it and what that experience, what effect that experience had on their life after. Because I think that's one of the things, in some ways, you think you want to get all those interviews at the time. If someone has just been in a battle, get them straight off the battlefield and say, right, Jim, what was it like going up that hill? But what you won't get from that interview is what Jim would have thought about that battle 20 years later. When we had Nicholas Young on a few weeks ago talking about his father, who eventually escaped in Italy and fought in Tunisia. His father carried some regret and survivor's guilt that wasn't really apparent to anybody until several decades had passed. So an archive like this has that element of reflection as well. And I'm assuming that was obviously important as well in your process.
Well, I think you're right. I think one of the things that makes this archive special, and I think it is absolutely brilliant archive, is that if you were, say, a child in the war, if you're writing 60 years later, you're reflecting on the war through the lens of your adult experiences.
Yes.
So it means that it's thoughtful, it's mature, as you say, it's often funny. But what I was trying to do was, because it struck me so vividly, was to make the reader feel that they were there at Monte Cassino, they were there in a prison camp, they were there in a bomber flying over Germany, because that's how the archive has been written. It's very experiential. It's very much of the moment that they were there. So I tried to etch in, of course, some of the bigger picture, so people understand why there's a war in a desert and how it's going. But actually, it's really about getting sand everywhere. In your food, in your clothes, or being under siege in Tobruk or somewhere else.
And I think, you made the point earlier about how well written and how well delivered these accounts were as well, because I think, again, there may be an assumption that, you've got to be a proper historian and have gone to university and got your degree in history to be able to convey the stories of people who went through the war, and that sometimes eyewitness accounts are a little bit, yes, I did that. Yep, we went up that hill. Yep, I remember that. And I've had that experience with veterans where you're not getting anything particularly vivid.
Yes.
Well, it's the language they're using is a little bit mundane, but in fact, as you said, you found people who are incredibly eloquent and incredibly able to put their opinions into the written form or oral histories. And but before we go on to the next thing is, Do you think there's a difference between writing your memoirs down as a participant and speaking to someone and actually being in a conducted interview?
Yes, I think there is quite a fundamental difference, and I think this has the strength of people writing. Sometimes it was writing at the time; it was a contemporary diary kept in, in on the battlefront. But quite often it was written down afterwards, and I think it gives people a time to reflect, to choose their words carefully. And sometimes when historians talk to veterans, I think the Imperial War Museum has a fantastic archive,
Yeah.
big, broad, huge. But people, I think, sometimes feel a little stiff, a little anxious. At the Imperial War Museum, I've got to be on my best behavior. So I'm not going to tell them really what it was like. I'm just going to tell them what I think they want me to tell them. And by writing it down, it's not like that.
No, absolutely. I remember having this discussion. I think it was with Peter Hart, who, of course, is the master of the archives in the Imperial War Museum. He said some of the British veterans would put on that voice you do when the police stop you. The guy normally
Yes.
talked like he's Well, I was going down the road at approximately 30 miles an hour, and you do that voice you're doing because you're on the spotlight. And I think also, and then we'll get to some of your individual stories in a minute, is that if you feel that you're one of 30 people being interviewed from a particular regiment or a particular ship, you may not feel that that's particularly important in the process, especially if perhaps you're on IRC in the RAF and you know that they're going to be interviewing a wing commander who got 10 confirmed kills of German aircraft in the next interview. You might think that your role isn't particularly important, and you sort of don't maybe emote in the same way. But as you say, the way this BBC archive is created is that everybody from land girl to child in the evacuees or whatever it would be was important, and that the story was worth hearing, even if you didn't necessarily receive a Victoria Cross for knocking out a machine gun in Monte Cassino.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I absolutely agree with that.
Brilliant. So let's talk about some of the stories. So we got a few photos of some of the people that feature. So here's number one.
This is Sergeant Gordon Walker, Jock Walker from Glasgow. He was a regular, and I chose him for the book because he writes very well. It's quite cynical. He's very honest about how much alcohol is drunk, or the brothels that are visited. But his story takes us all away from the Battle of France. He escapes from Dunkirk. He's then in the Desert War, where he's driving a repair truck. He retrains as a parachutist, and drops into Sicily and Italy. He then retrains later on again, as you can see, a camera here, as an army cameraman, which is quite a dangerous thing to do. And he films at Arnhem. He films at the liberation of Belsen concentration camp, and he carries on filming up until to Berlin. So his narrative, his story takes you keep coming back to him throughout the book, which is a helpful thread through it.
And I think someone like that, who sees the war from different angles, in a sense automatically becomes a better witness because they have a broad sense of the war. Some people never left the engine room of a particular ship for 4 years, and that's absolutely valid, their experiences. Or someone, for example, a housewife in a certain city in London, their experience is fantastic, but it's narrow. But someone who goes from the desert and was a truck driver and then a paratrooper and then a photographer, you get that range of experiences. So that I suppose in the writing you get comparisons. This isn't like it was in the desert, because now and the new situations become relevant.
You're completely right. He loved the desert, but he was able to contrast what it was like fighting in France, with fighting in the desert. And he also sensed the ebb and flow of the war. He knew that the Allies were on the back foot, obviously at Dunkirk and and afterwards. But he sensed the momentum shifting in the desert, as Montgomery got his troops better organized and the supply lines became very stretched on the German side. And you could see, so he's good at capturing how things are starting to shift.
And that's very important, I think, because a lot of people got through the war by deliberately not thinking about what's happening next. Because I think if you're a Brit or you're an Aussie in 1941, it was all a bit bleak looking forward. So perhaps best not to. Perhaps just best to just live on a day-to-day basis and kind of believe in Churchill in a sense and hope it all gets better. But you get these few people who are a bit more, the forward thinking, and they, as you say, they are thinking about, hang on, this isn't going very well, but maybe we're learning to do this better, and maybe next time we do this, we'll have learned how to do this. And those kind of voices are very rare, because that's traditionally the role of the historian years later, to then say, okay, we can now see that this particular campaign here may have had a tricky start, but look how the Allies learned to do this, and by the time they fight in this campaign, they've mastered that. So anyone who's there, boots on the ground, who is seeing some of this this change is good. So anything particular that you think he witnessed that was the key part to the learning process that these participants went through?
I think that for him, Arnhem was it obviously was for everyone at Arnhem, but he was one of a group of soldiers who were trapped around the HQ at the Hartenstein Hotel, and he saw lots of acts of courage and bravery, but at the same time he could see that Arnhem was born to be a failure as a military operation. It went on too long, preparations weren't adequate, and I think that was, and then his photographs became very valuable. So he has flown out of Arnhem, almost one of the first soldiers home, and he gets a hero's welcome, and he can't quite believe it, because he's seen how beaten up lots of ways the Allies were, and he'd had to escape on a boat across the river to get out, and the value of his photographs for propaganda is huge. So I think they sold it for £156,000, a lot of money in those days, around the world. His photographs of Arnhem, not that he got any of it. So I think that was I think that he realised the value of photography and film in the war in terms of influencing the population's opinion, and I think he saw how you could just be a pawn in a bigger game. Someone decides that they're going to get to Germany via Arnhem and the other bridges over the other rivers in Holland, and that's it.
No, thank you for that. So the next thing I want to bring up with you, and this may apply to the other people you wrote about, is the broad concept of survivor's guilt. Because if you start interviewing people 60 years or now 80 years, as some, Lucy, who's in the sidebar, who's on in a couple of hours time with us, her interviews were conducted in the last 3 or 4 years, as I understand it. People have got, anyone who has survived that long, who went through World War II, is now in the minority. That there are those that fell during the actual conflict. Then there's all the others that passed away either in tragic circumstances, as we know, people with PTSD. There's suicide. There's alcoholism. There's people, going off on adventures. Paddy Mayne, people like that who have tragic post-war careers. But you end up surviving through the 2000s. Even if you had a pretty shitty war, you're going to be looking back and thinking, yeah, but I'm still here. Was that something that you saw across these interviews? A sense of both gratitude for having made it so long, but also guilt that you did make it so long?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. Jock, quite common perhaps, but right towards the end of the war, he'd been in the war so long, he'd been in so many battlefronts, that he started to almost lose his nerve. He started to think, well, it must be my turn soon. I'm not going to make it through. And I think that the sense of guilt that he had, but also lots of men and women who served, was some guilt at the time. Why I'm standing here, and someone is standing right next to me, and they get shot, and I don't. So they start to feel guilty. After the war, I think that starts to build as they get older, and Jock didn't, but quite a lot of the key figures in the book lived into their 90s, which is extraordinary, when they may have been prisoners of the Japanese or been shot at in several battlefronts. And I think that all the time they want to remember their comrades, their friends, the people alongside them, and they do feel guilty. There's a vivid description of a Battle of Britain pilot crashing, and he says, I've got survivor's guilt. He says it just plainly as that. Why did I survive? Why did I survive? And all my so many of my colleagues died.
I think this brings us back to this idea of a book like yours and Lucy's later on, is that if, for example, you're collecting veterans' memoirs, as I am right now for a book I'm doing about Normandy, I'm not particularly interested for the book I'm doing, because it's an operational study, in whether or not chap A had PTSD after all, because it's not the reason for my book. My reason is to explain the battle. But a book like yours, you can absolutely say that. You can completely put in the moments when people were terrified, the moments that people had self-doubt, and as you said there, the survivor's guilt after war. And I think another thing that's important is you don't have to be in direct combat to have those experiences. Well, PTSD can come from people just through working very hard. I'm sure people working in factories under long hours who weren't necessarily in danger felt that pressure of the war effort, or a mother raising children with limited food could create PTSD. But so talking of non-combat roles, and we had a lovely show with Joanna Fote a couple weeks ago about the Lumberjills. This is Land Army. I mean, I've got a real soft spot for the Land Army, the Lumberjills, and their story I don't think has been told enough. So who is this?
She's called Betsy Merritt, and she's just a typical land girl. I think it's very important that the book isn't just about the battlefront, but it's about the home front too. And you realize that everyone's world changes, that 19, 20-year-old men who've hardly been out of their hometown suddenly find themselves in the desert or in Italy or in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. And very often it was the same with women. Obviously, many served in the WAFs or the Wrens, but a lot of them became land girls, and they escaped from their probably quite Victorian parents at that time, and as young women went to work doing, in inverted commas, men's jobs. And they were immediately conscious of the farmers thinking, oh, these town girls are never going to be able to do this. They're never going to use a scythe or bring in the hay or manage a tractor. But women like Betsy could.
Yeah. I think it's important to remember, I'm sure with these accounts, that these women actually enjoyed it. Not the war, not the fact that there's but the fact that it is liberating. They are getting to do things they hadn't got to do. The war, the world was very sexist back then. We can't sugarcoat it and say it was completely fair. But nevertheless, women were doing things they hadn't been allowed to do before and getting off to do certain places. And I think, again, 60 years later, it would be okay to say, you know what, I quite enjoyed that aspect. I didn't like the fact that the country's being bombed, but I enjoyed being away from home. I enjoyed being away from my mum and dad and the rules, as you say, of kind of the Victorian society that was pervading before the war. So is that something that you were maybe surprised at, is that people had fond memories of the war? Because again, we think about this idea of everything being tragic, and yes, World War II was, but as I said, my granddad, who was in the Royal Artillery, never left the UK. He loved the war. He made a bit of cash. He played violin in a pub, that kind of thing. He got to see people, so he kind of loved the war. It's almost arguably the best time of his life.
I think that for lots of young women, it was a romantic. It was an escape, and also they learned skills. So I think that they felt that they changed and learned all. And of course, the same for young men. There were men who arrived and looked around and looked at their officers and thought, actually, I'm as clever as he is. He just made I wouldn't have made that decision. I would have made another decision.
Yeah.
And so I think they started to value themselves in a different way. So I think that was important. The difficulty was what happens at the end of the war, when, if you've been a Battle of Britain pilot at 20, that might have been the peak of your experiences. Or if you're a land girl who can repair a tractor, what do you do after the war when the men come home? So that was tricky. But I think that it was transformational for many people, and positive for many people. I don't know whether you've got the video of the story of the land girl, the first video, but that is just
Is that the one, Mitzi?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is one of the videos that John created during the creation. So I'll play that now, folks. So here we go. It's just a minute or so long.
Yeah.
The farmers weren't too keen to have us, but we were cheap labour and it was wartime. I expect the thoughts were mixed when they saw us town girls. I mean, most of us were around 5 feet 2 inches and we weighed about 8 stones. They must have thought they'll not last. Well, they were wrong. We tackled all the jobs. Spud planting and picking was a hated job, especially picking in the rain, struggling to pull our feet out of that mud and sometimes leaving our wellies behind and dragging our buckets along. And when we were working in the fields, there were no toilet facilities. So to answer a call of nature, we'd go behind a hedge. Spending a penny was okay after we'd undone the dungaree straps, but to have a tuppenny one was, well, that was more of a problem. I mean, we rarely had any paper. So a good strong dock leaf had to do. And there was always the peril of nettles. Many a nettled bum was had.
Wow. I love that the fact you used an actress to read that, because sometimes that gives a little bit of lift to accounts there. But that the practicalities of women having to wipe themselves with a dock leaf is and nettles and all that in the field is something you don't think about when you see the parades of the Land Army girls with their smart hats and their jumpers in 1945.
It's very basic, and there's further on in the account, and Christine, who read it might have been here live, but she's about to go to China to tour on Murder on the Orient Express.
Oh wow!
And later on, it's described how Italian prisoners of war worked alongside the land girls, which was quite interesting, and sometimes German prisoners of war too. And they all fancied themselves as Romeo, so that you would get, if they had some toilet paper, they'd write, "Ciao bello," meet me behind the cowshed later. So I think there was quite a lot of flirtation going on with the Italians.
Absolutely. I mean, I love these personal stories. So we'll keep on moving. And children is something, you didn't just put the views of adults in the book. And as you said, the original BBC archive, people contributed their memories as an adult, but they were a child when these things happen. And of course, the children's voices of World War II are maybe less heard, because I think we have this, well, this kid's 11, what could they possibly know about things? But what did you have a broad experience of what the children's accounts were like, and how detailed, and whether they had a different attitude?
Well, this is a photo of a kinder transport.
Yeah.
And if you look at it, it's quite interesting. If you look at the faces, these kids don't look unhappy. They've been separated from their parents. They've been sent on a train to Harwich and then on to somewhere else. And I used it today partly for that reason, partly that in the middle back next to the man with a violin is someone who finished up running the BBC, Sir Paul Fox. He later became Sir Paul Fox. So it shows you that how much they did. And I think for children, it was also transformational because, yes, they were worried about where their parents were and what was happening to their brother, and they were hearing odd reports. But basically, it was an amazing time of freedom, because their playground would be the bomb sites of British cities, where they would pick up old bits of ordnance or bits of metal and create their own fireworks. So I think it was very liberating, and a lot of them finished up being more adult and having more adult responsibility than they would have done. If you were an evacuee, if you were 9 or 10, chances are you might have a 5-year-old sibling with you, and you were acting in loco parentis. You were sent away from your parents somewhere apparently safe, but you might have to look after your young brother or sister. But I also included this picture because of, just as a reminder to why the war was fought. It was because the parents of these young people were likely to finish up in Auschwitz or another concentration camp, and we fought it to stop that happening to us in Britain. And it's just worth always remembering why we fought the war.
Absolutely. And on the subject of the Holocaust and perhaps the Eastern Front again, the BBC archive was quite international. There are accounts there of people from around the world, and again, we think that maybe we wouldn't hear those accounts, but there's all that people of population who move after all. We've got a show tomorrow about the Latvians who ended up living in England after World War II, who'd been pressed into service with the Germans. So there was that group of people who ended up in the UK after the war, who had started in Poland or Czechoslovakia
Yes.
or the other side of the world. So was there a common denominator in those voices in the archive of people who had, with all due respect to my granddad never saw the real horrors of World War II. You know, he never left searchlight and anti-aircraft bases in the UK, whereas people who've been out in, you know, Romania or Hungary or the Baltic states, they had absolutely seen the horrors of World War II. Does that mean the accounts by people who'd seen that were different? Were they more visceral? Were they more restrained? Was there anything you particularly noticed in those accounts?
No, they were very visceral. I think what happened was that the BBC's decision to collect all this material gave all the people permission to speak, because lots of people who came on kinder transport or were moved across Europe by the war, pushed and pulled, they didn't always want to talk about it after the war in particular. And I think when the BBC started collecting the material, they suddenly thought, yes, it's right, I can say this now. You know, I was in Hamburg when the Brits dropped bombs on me. This is what it was like.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think if you were someone like that, you wouldn't necessarily have said that thing immediately after one. Of course, we have to remember that a lot of people ended up living under communism for another 3 decades or more, and even the environment in which to speak about the war wasn't the same. You know, whereas if you were living in Britain or the USA and you wanted to, you know, draw a crowd in a pub and tell your war stories, you absolutely could. But a Czech pilot going back to the what was now the Eastern Bloc wasn't able to do that. So again, 60 years later, allowed for some of these voices that had not been told to come out. And one of your favorite stories in the book is one of the Lancaster pilots, and so this is one of his paintings. So tell us about him.
For me, this is one of the most vivid chapters in the whole book. It's called A Night to Remember. It's about one single night of a Lancaster bomber crew flying to Germany, and the pilot was called Ron Holmes, and he describes it so brilliantly that you feel that your heart is stopping as you're reading it, because you feel that you're in the plane with them. And it's absolutely, it's so vivid and so clear, you just can't think about anything else. And it's particularly good. There's an audio version of The People's War, an audio book done by Penguin, and you know, of course, when it's read by an actor, it's even stronger. And he was an artist, and so he taught art after the war, taught industrial design, and painted aircraft. And this is Lancaster, but he painted a lot of fantastic paintings of aircraft. So I like that chapter, because you feel like you're present in the moment.
And I think, again, going back to that archive, I remember, because that came up in my family. There were some family members were kind of cajoled into writing something by their next of kin, or their husbands, their wives, who didn't really want to talk about it. And again, I think one of the problems with the military histories maps, when they were writing about a particular regiment back in the 60s and 70s, they would automatically go to the British Legion or the Veterans Association or the reunions. And that's fine, except you get the people who attend reunions, the people who join the British Legion, because a lot of people who served or participated in World War II, just as you said earlier, they just simply went back home. They weren't the kind of people to carry on meeting their service comrades. In this case, you know, became an artist. And so I think that variety of voices was important, is that in some ways you get the better stuff from people who didn't really want to talk about it at all, but sort of did eventually out of whatever reason, I say, being cajoled by a family member, because
yes,
in that military environment of the reunions, you get that sort of showmanship of people outdoing each other with stories. And well, I knocked out 3 tanks, and then but I'll beat your 3. I knocked out 4. And I'm not saying that veterans exaggerate, but there is that sort of that situation can happen.
You're right, Paul, and very often it's the quiet ones who actually do the amazing things and have the amazing stories, but they're not necessarily the ones who talk about it. So I think that this particular moment, there was one person whose family I know, he didn't talk about it and write anything down until he was 91. He'd been a prisoner of the Japanese, and he got to 91 before he finally. So it's quite common, and it was one of the strong feelings about the book. That's why it's so big. The archive is
Yeah.
it was like a logjam of memories, waiting to be broken, waiting for the water to flow with all these stories, and as if people were waiting for this moment for the BBC, for someone to listen to them who wasn't in the family.
And I'm glad you've done the book, because I've used the archive myself, and no offense to the creator of the website, it's a bit clunky. It's a bit early 2000s. It could do with some updating and better coding behind it to find it more accessible. As you say, some of the best accounts are not very visible there. But let's keep on moving through. So Tim Hardy.
Yeah, Tim Hardy. Well, he is another one of those characters whose story takes you from early in the war all the way through, and there are sort of two themes with him. He's quite cynical about what happens in the war, and I'll just read you actually how he starts as a joins up. He's a Nottingham, works in a factory in Nottingham. He's from a coal mining family, and this is just the sort of example of his tone at age 17. He joined up and said, "I was disguised in an ill-fitting uniform. I stood guard over our sacred realm. In reality, piddling little airstrip at Hucknall Torkard. I'm given a 1914-18 rifle and bayonet, a ridiculous tent-shaped cap that wouldn't stay on my head, a pair of second-hand hobnail boots with puttees I could never have fastened properly, and a cap badge saying Sherwood Foresters. Robin Hood would have been disgusted. Decked out thus throughout the first winter of the war, I stood guard over crappy little outposts that Hitler, in his craziest carpet-chewing moments, couldn't possibly have wanted to seize." So he has a good turn of phrase, and quite cynical, but it shows you how ill prepared we were at the beginning of the war in lots of ways. And the tone goes on, and he also spends most of the war he falls in love quite quickly. He's in a troupe of traveling actors. He does it to kind of escape out of the Sherwood Foresters and finish up in a concert party, falls in love with a young woman in the front row, and spends the rest of the war pursuing her until in 1945 they get married. And so constantly you're coming back to his feelings about her and his desires for her, even though they're at other ends of the country. And he finishes up in the end training himself as a parachutist to try and impress her. He thought, I'm not going to impress her in a concert party, so I'm going to train as a parachutist. And he's there on D-Day.
I mean, that's a very good point. Is a lot of people joined the rather more glamorous units to impress the birds. I'm using language of the time. It wasn't all the money or the increased pay. It wasn't necessarily to serve the country in the best role. Some people did do that, but often it was there were ulterior purposes. And I think there are some great books about the romances that blossomed in World War II, and I love some of them. But I think also there was a tendency in the post-war era to kind of romanticize it and take away, if I may be so bold, the horniness of young people in World War II, because of this feeling that the war can come crashing down around you. You might not live till the next week. So I think, understanding that young people at war wanted to do it, I think is something that we should accept, and marriages could be born out of just that desire to live in the moment.
Well, everything speeded up. Everything happened really fast. You met a girl, or a girl met a man, and he might be going off to the desert 6 days later, so you got married. All the rules of war were all jumbled up in lots of ways, things that you never thought about doing before, but you now suddenly felt that you could or you should. So I think things changed a lot in terms of relationships.
Absolutely, and probably for the better in some ways. So let's keep on moving through. So another couple of people.
Well, this is in a way reflecting what we've just been talking about, Paul, in terms of relationships. this is Douglas and Jean, and they have a chapter to themselves because they fall in love by letter. Douglas is in the desert, and he was a dental technician, and you think, oh gosh, you know, how you're surprised they've got dentists in the desert, but you needed them because soldiers can't fight with toothache. But he spent a lot of time actually doing much more sophisticated things, repairing damaged faces, and he invented various bits of medical kit out of old tubes or out of old windscreen wipers and that sort of thing. And she was 18, a student, and he knew her grandmother, and she suddenly starts writing to him. And over a period of time, the relationship, which starts out as quite, you know, very gently, becomes quite passionate. And eventually, like a scene from a movie, they meet on Doncaster railway station, just like Brief Encounter. And he'd been injured at El Alamein. He'd stood on a landmine, so he's limping along, and she sees him, and he has got his ticket in his glove, and he can't get it out, and he's so desperate to see her, he just throws the glove with the ticket inside at the ticket inspector. They fall into each other's arms, and the whole station goes, oh, because it's the first time they'd met after 2.5 years of correspondence, and they too got married, and it all worked out well.
Wow. I get goosebumps hearing those kind of stories, and you know that would have happened across the globe. And talking about across the globe, the other thing that I think that archive and your book brings is cultures meeting each other in World War II. That's it. That, you know, the war was tragic. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. You know, millions being killed, but people did get to meet people from other parts of the world. All the British and Australian troops who went to Burma and Myanmar got to see people there. They may have got to go to India. The people who went through the Suez Canal or to Alexandria and got to see the pyramids. And we talked about that fairly recently with a unit of coming up that all stopped off at the pyramids, and opportunities to see people and see cultures and races coming together as well. So again, you know, the early 2000s would have been in an era of people being much more forthcoming about race and making sure that the war was inclusive. Remember that it wasn't just white people fighting other white people. So tell us about some of the people in the book that aren't, you know, from different walks of life who contributed articles, and ones and people that you particularly, you know, think are significant.
Well, we've got a photograph of GIs dancing, and of course, this was the thing that really was a massive shift. There were more, more GIs, 1 million, I think it is, GIs, including black GIs, who were in the UK waiting mainly for D-Day, and of course, most Brits had never seen an American, let alone a black American, and there was lots of tensions between the white and black American troops because it was a segregated army. Segregated at home and segregated on the battlefront. I think that the host nation, us, were much less bothered about it. They were exotic, they were exciting, they had stockings and cigarettes and chocolate and other things. They were smart uniforms. And there were quite a lot of relationships that developed between GIs and also between local girls. So it was really quite transformational. But there were fights. If I just might read just quickly one other little bit. This was in Bristol. The well-mannered black American soldiers were welcomed by the local girls, but not by their white comrades. And a woman wrote, "We're confronted with hordes of white Americans, all arms and legs, and in an ugly, angry mood. A young woman with a black American was intending to proceed down Castle Street. The white American soldiers surged forward and hit the black American soldier on the head, and he fell to the ground with the girl screaming. What a sight. As far as we could see in the direction of West Street was American soldiers. The whole area was a seething mass. Definitely time to go home."
Mm.
I think there was quite a lot of tensions, but there was also there's a little story there of a boy in Glasgow who goes to deliver some groceries or papers to a GI unit just outside get picked up by a huge man and just put down and given a bit of chocolate, and the man's mate said, "Well, don't you know who that is?" "No, that's Joe Lewis, the heavyweight champion of the world," basically. And that was the first time he'd ever seen someone who was an African American.
Wow. I mean, and we forget that those mixes were happening, and they're, in some ways we look back romantically on World War II. You know, the Britain alone 1940 idea that is in many ways nonsense, in that there are people across the empire standing up for the good of humanity and what have you. So you know, they're reminding ourselves that people were coming together, and yet it wasn't perfect. There were clashes across the world between cultures and colors and religions, and it's important to understand all those things happened and move from them. So we'll carry on back to some
yes, this is back to Jock Walker. This is
Yep.
just a reminder of him. This is after Arnhem. 3 cameramen from the Army Film and Photographic number 5 unit, and they this is when they were flown back to Elstree Studios, Pinewood Studios, and they're treated as heroes. And you can see they look quite happy not being at Arnhem anymore and being there. So it was just a reminder of the kind of ups and downs of war.
Yeah.
1 minute you're, the next minute this is happening.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and a classic photo. And so, Phyllis's story, incredible, because across the Far East, all sorts of peoples were just suddenly their lives thrown apart with the arrival of the Japanese and their internments, and people moved around and camps, things like that. So, and again, I think we tend to think of the experiences of the men, the male population, and we think of Shangi and the Kwai Railway and what have you, but plenty of women had terrible ordeals through World War II. So tell us about this lady.
She, again, is one of those narrative characters whose story takes you through for many years. She was a nurse in Malaya, a colonial nurse in Malaya, when Pearl Harbor and more or less simultaneously the invasion of Malaya by the Japanese takes place. And she's driven south, still working in hospitals when she can, finished up in Singapore, where she's again treating the wounded and injured in Singapore. And she, like everyone else, eventually escapes out of Singapore in a rusty old ship. A lot of them were sunk. She was, in a way, lucky that she was captured. But, that's early 1942, and she doesn't get out till 1945. And her camp in Sumatra was so remote that basically the war had been over. The war in Japan had been over for over a month before she was discovered and found in her camp. And of the 15 women who started with her, I don't know whether they were the ones bowing here, but this was taken in her camp, this photograph. 15 women, only 5 survived. So she was one of only 5 survivors, because malnutrition, disease, there was not enough food, they had to work very hard. There was probably not quite so much brutality as there was on the Thai-Burma Railway or in other parts of the Japanese Empire when it came to male prisoners, but they were still really, really badly treated. And she kept a diary at the time in which she writes with credible dignity, and so you get a real sense of what it was like. And she got engaged in Singapore, and after the war goes back to look for her fiance, to discover that he had died when his ship was sunk back in 1942. So she'd been living on false hopes, but she eventually did marry someone else. And this is a picture taken from her obituary, and she died aged 100. So
that's a fair old innings, isn't it? Wow. Yeah. I mean,
pretty amazing. And it's just the Christine, who read to you earlier, reads her character on the audiobook, and she says, she's my hero. She's the one in the book that I associate most with, and I because she's what we've talked about before. She's quiet. She just
Yeah.
gets on with it. She's nursing, she's helping others, she's supporting others. She's got some very close friends there, and they support each other. The comradeship is important, and it's a bit of watery soup and a bit of rice, and once they got a bit of panther meat. I don't know what it tastes like, but I probably wouldn't recommend it for your supper tonight. And that was a luxury, and that's how they survived. And again, they kept going at the beginning by they started a little choir, although there was no music. They did little performances. They made things for the kids at Christmas to give them a good time, little handmade cards or whatever it was. So they did their best to try to find ways of diverting themselves away from the horrors of what was happening on a day-to-day basis. But in the end, it was about food. It's about finding enough food to live for the next day.
Thank you. And do you think there was a common denominator in people who survive, getting through traumatic experiences, be it as a Lancaster pilot or a nurse in a camp? You talked about humor early on. You talked about her quiet resolve there, and having side projects, the choir there, and things like that. Is there a life force or a survival force that some people have? Obviously, luck comes into play. You're just on the wrong ship on the wrong time, and it gets sunk and torpedoed, and you're down. But do you think there is something that unites people who live long lives, who's went through adversity?
Yes, I do. I think that some doctors call it, survivor syndrome, and I think that you can tell. I've met some survivors who, in their early hundreds, who survived Japanese imprisonment, and the minute you meet them, you think, "I know why you survived." They have a kind of uncrushable inner spirit that whatever happens to them, they want to. So, but once you give up the ghost and
Yeah.
you lose that, then you're not going to survive. But that is quite a common factor that you can see it. You can just see why they survive. It helps. Luck, of course, is important.
Yeah.
Friendship is important. I think having skills is also important. Being able, in Phyllis's case, she was a nurse, and I think that was a distraction because she could help others.
Yeah.
But being able to, out of bits of wire and wood, being able to make something. There's one of the men I met got to 102, and he made himself a banjo with some stolen telephone wire and bits of wood, and he carried the banjo when he could, because that that could keep him and his mates amused up to a point. So inventiveness, but in the end it is about the human spirit, that even when you're pushed to the extremes, and my word, the people in the Japanese camps were pushed to the very extreme of human experience, they'd want to give up.
Yeah. So we got another reading from Christine, your friend, about Roy Weaver. So do we want to introduce who he is before we do the clip, or just play the clip? And
of course, I think that as you get to the end of the war, I was just talking about Phyllis being released, a long time after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and even longer, and then even after the Japanese surrendered on August the 15th. She doesn't get out for another few weeks and can't find her fiance. So there's lots of loose strands after a war of disconnection, people trying to reconnect, people trying to re-establish themselves with their partner, with their family, with their job and everything else. And this is about Roy Weaver, who comes from Suffolk, who 50 years after the war discovers that the man he thought was his father is not his father, but the father was an American GI. And this is what happens.
Okay, thank you.
I looked at the number that was straight in front of me, and I swear to God that my blood reached boiling point. This was the closest I had ever been. This must be him. I mean, it had to be him. I heard an older man's voice. Hello? This is Ken Weaver. I began by asking if he was based in Parham, Suffolk during the war. Yeah, sure I was, he said. Do you remember a lady? Her name was Lou Ellis. I remember her very well, came his reply. From what my sister tells me, I think there is a strong possibility that we could be father and son. I stopped talking. I dried up. I waited with my heart thumping like a sledgehammer. After just a few seconds, Ken slowly replied, "It's more than a strong possibility. I don't know how long you have been searching, partner, but it's over now. You found the man you are looking for."
Wow. Incredible stuff. Absolutely incredible stuff. And so that leads into a question we had from Lucy early on, a different Lucy than the Lucy on today. Love the storytelling. He says, you say at the back of the book, you spent time with them, that you got to know these people. So people you didn't even meet, you got to know. And you said how Christine felt the Phyllis's story was the one that inspired her. When you spend a lot of time reading and understanding someone through their thoughts, their diaries, you do get to know them. It's a trite interviewer's question, but as a human being, did writing this book change you? I know the previous one you came on and you talked about the people who, you know, in the camps who witnessed the atomic bomb there, but did you make lifelong friends of people you'd never met?
Well, first of all, I'm very impressed that Lucy read all the way to the end of the book, or maybe she just went to the final chapter. Don't know. But I say in the book that I spent so long working on it, and there was so much material that I felt that these became my friends. And for me, Phyllis and Jock and the other main characters in it were all people who I really got to know well. And it's frustrating that I never got to meet them. There are one or two people I did meet in the book who were over 100. No, I read it all and loved it. Well done, Lucy. Very good. The check's in the post. But they did feel like friends, and I felt quite sad when I finished the book and said goodbye to them. And I'm meeting Phyllis's daughter. I've spoken on the phone and everything else to her, but I'm meeting her. She lives in Ireland, so I'm not meeting her until a couple of weeks' time. And then I met recently Douglas and Jean, the couple who had a pen pal love. Their daughter's been very helpful and supportive, Ruth, and she came to the launch of the book. And I'm, as a sort of in return, I'm going up to Northumberland to a bookshop up there near where she lives and where Douglas and Jean lived to talk about Douglas and Jean there. And I'm really looking forward to that. Getting to know their children is the best that I can do. But I felt like I'd lost a friend when I finished the book. It's very curious. I never thought I would think like that, but I did.
And my last question, thank you for that, by the way, is about, I said you before that we went live, I was going to ask you this one, is we are, as I've said before, we're at the end of the era where we can go and interview the people from the war. I mean, well, there are a handful left, but not many. What does the future hold in terms of historians and others incorporating the voices of people from World War II? Because I have a bit of a fear that the next of kin, children and grandkids, will start relating their loved ones' stories, but a bit of accuracy will be lost in that some of the family legends build up, and we have it in Normandy all the time where people contact guides and say, my dad landed on Omaha Beach or Sword Beach on June the 6th. And what happens is they were in a unit that landed 3 weeks later because the veteran said, I landed on Sword Beach, which he did. But in the family telling, they backdate it to June the 6th because that's the bit of the invasion they know about. They forget about the 76 days that followed. So as someone who spent a lot of time with oral histories and program making in your various roles over the year and writing books, what are you confident about the future, or a bit cautious about how it will move forward?
I think I say in the introduction to the book that after so many decades, some of the facts are a little slippery. But in the end, particularly when you've got such a weight of testimony, that it has an underlying truth and what you called earlier on an emotional truth. So this is what it felt like to be at Monte Cassino. And if someone didn't quite get the date right, that's not really what the book is about. I think that what has to happen when the last Battle of Britain pilot has gone, there were 33 VJ Day veterans up at the National Arboretum last week. That's only 33. I think that what will have to happen is that the oral testimonies, like in my book, will be there. But historians will now have to go backwards. We'll have to go back to more original sources to check, double check, and use these testimonies as part of the color palette of what they describe and what they tell. But I think it's going to force historians not to, like me, not to rely on the stories of veterans, but to actually go back to what happened and why.
That's a very positive one. I like the phrase color palette there, and I think that's what I hope for, is that people will. It's a tool in the toolbox. The oral archives, the interviews of veterans, they are a tool that historians will have, but they're not the only tool. There are aerial photos, there are the war diaries, the after action reports. There's all those means of cross-referencing things. And as I said, I think that's, I use expression, emotional truth doesn't change. If a veteran tells you he was shit scared during a particular incident, then he almost certainly was, even if he remembers it being a Tuesday when in fact it was a Friday, or he remembered it being the Scots Guards to his left when in fact it was the Coldstream Guards, whatever. I think that's where we need to. It's about us as human beings understanding the resource we're using. And I'll be having the same discussion with Lucy on the next show, is that, an account by someone is really interesting and really important, but it's one of many sources. And what are you trying to do with that source? As you've done with your book, you're just sort of, here it is. Here is what these people said, and take it as that.
I mean, I've tried obviously to tell the best stories, to create a narrative, and then to build a jigsaw puzzle of all these different testimonies and memories, which I think is one way of looking. No one needs to read through the 47,000 testimonies again, because I've done it now. But I do think that historians will have to think more carefully going forward about what the source is and how credible the source is as you move forward. Was it told to me was this story direct? Was it in a diary, in letters, or was it told by someone's grandchild 60 years later, or their neighbor, or someone else? So it's really important to know where these stories have come from, and then to put it into context. And I think the other thing that will be important is the other side. Is this is where being English is not helpful, but reading and understanding more about what was happening in Germany, what the German, the equivalent of the People's War Germany, as it were, and what it was like. I think that would be really interesting. And I think there's obviously been some very good work about that, not much about the Japanese, but I think it would be really interesting to test what the sources are like there.
Absolutely. I think that, your music to my ears there. I just started Alex Churchill and Nikolai's book, A Ring of Fire, about 1914, the First World War, and the voices they've got from around the world, not just one African voice, but East African, West African, North African, different people in the same regions. And the ability we have now with DeepL and Google and other translation devices to get that information, and also just to make contact with each other. The number of archives that people are able to access now without even leaving their desk, and only a small percentage of stuff has been digitalized. So that in 20 years' time, who knows what may be available to download and look at and access.
I think you're right. I think you're right.
It's good to be positive. So
exactly. Let's not be too despondent about it.
Another thing is, of course, your book could easily lead to volume 2 and volume 3 and volume 4.
Well, I'm waiting for the call from the publisher. Yes, it's bubbling along very nicely, but there's a lot of material there, but I don't quite know what's going to be next.
So to sum it up, Kevin said there, I really enjoyed these nostalgic presentations. Wish I'd spoken with Mum and Dad more about the war before they passed. And Mike said, some lump in the throat moments in this episode. Thanks, Woody and John. So that's it. We have done our job, John. So as I said earlier, folks, the links to the book are in the description below. You can find it wherever you buy your books. I look forward to having an invitation to invite you back in the future, John. But in the meantime, I'm back in 2 hours' time with Lucy to continue this discussion with her book on a similar theme. So, folks, thank you very much for your questions. Consider becoming a patron or YouTube channel member. Buy my guest books, visit their websites, read their blogs, watch their YouTube channels, listen to their podcasts, so they will create more history for us. So there we are. Thank you very much. I will see you all later on. Cheers. Bye.
Yes.